our last presentation today. It's a very long day. And then, first of all, I would like to thank John Chaplin to come here from the other part of the world. And then with the jet lag also in his body. But he's a very interesting person for us. John is director of the Annenberg Innovation Lab in the University of Southern California. He's specialized in international communication management and the field of digital media entertainment. And has a very long history of things. You could find the short bio into the documents found here. But personally, I would like to thank very much the effort to come to Madrid and to stay with us, because for us it's very interesting to understand what is happening there. And then thank you very much for coming. You have the floor.
Thank you, Gonzalo. I'm going to pivot a little bit here and talk more about the media and entertainment technology ecosystem, in the sense that my lab has been in existence for almost 4 years. It is supported by corporations in a kind of consortium model. So IBM, Warner Brothers, Fox, Cisco, DirecTV, Orange, Havas, Star TV, India, Viacom, Verizon. And unlike a lot of what we heard, we basically think of this as the corporations give us support, and our job is to focus on creating rapid prototypes of where the media and entertainment industry platforms will go in the future. Unlike the MIT Media Lab, which we are often compared to, we don't focus on gadgets. MIT Media Lab spent 15 years building the one laptop per child, and by the time it was out, there were $200 or $100 platforms that were in India, were on tablets. So it was nonsense, and we don't think we can ever get ahead of the hardware companies. And so that's not what we think about. We think about the application layer, we think about the business models, the way people tell stories. We've done a lot of work in big data analytics. I think we've done some really pioneering work on trying to think about, in social sentiment, the role of sarcasm and other things like that, which kind of mess up every big data analytic model. I'll give you an example. When we were looking at the presidential race, the first tweets we saw were, "I'm so happy Michelle Bachmann has thrown her tinfoil hat in the ring." Now, the computer doing natural language processing thought that was very positive for Michelle Bachmann, because it had no idea what tinfoil hat means. And for those of you who are in Europe and don't know that, it means people who are weird and think they're in touch with Mars. Anyway, so what I want you to think about is, we've been doing all this work, and about 6 months ago, some of our big sponsors came to us and said, look, some of the ideas you've been putting forth, that the media and entertainment business is under an extraordinary amount of creative destruction, are really coming true. And we want you to help think about this in a much more ecological way. And so we began to think about this. And I think this is really important, because when I think of Spain particularly, I think of the fact that there are 320 million people whom English is their first language. And there are 460 million people who Spanish is their first language. So when I think of a world, which I think is coming very soon, of 5 billion, with a B, connected smartphones, and what is the kind of media and entertainment that's going to be on these platforms, You know, there are Chinese manufacturers who are selling $25 Android connected smartphones in Africa. I think that Spain is going to have a huge role in this platform. So the project that we're doing is called the Edison Project. And we call it that because, needless to say, 105 years ago, with all due respect to my French friends, Thomas Edison at least started the motion picture business. And he built a studio which doesn't look too much different than the studios that are in Hollywood or Mumbai or other places. And so even though we've made gigantic progress, we haven't really changed the model too much. So this should be the greatest time in the history of the media and entertainment business, because at least outside of the United States, the middle class is growing at astronomically fast rates. So we think middle class spending in Asia, for instance, is going to go from 4.8 trillion in 2010 to 32.6 trillion in 2030. That's just astonishing. And when people get out of poverty and begin to have some discretionary income, the first thing they do is get one of these, or get a television, or go to the movies, or do something. They interface with the media and entertainment economy. And so that should be a really good thing. The second thing, for the first time, we have a global platform that if you make something once, it plays anywhere. When I was making movies in the 70s with Martin Scorsese, I made a movie called Mean Streets, I made a movie called The Last Waltz. You couldn't have global media distribution because you had PAL, CCAM, NTSC, you had global standards for different regions of video, and there was no way you could do global distribution. But today you can. It's called the internet, and it's as long as you are in MPEG 4, thanks to Fraunhofer and everything else, it works anywhere. You make it in the United States, it plays in Africa. And this platform is also growing just as fast as that global media, 9x in 5 years. The third thing, and this is just kind of an amusing slide from my friends at Facebook, is an estimation that there will be 5 billion smartphones by 2016. Now, if you think about that, the law of large numbers becomes really interesting. So let's just say I could make a TV series of 12 episodes, and I could sell it for $1, and I could get 10% market share of this global marketplace. That's $500 million. That's a very good profit for me to make that TV series. So it begins to help us think about, and especially for our friends at Telefonica and my friends at Verizon and Orange, what is the role of micropayments in a universe of connected devices? Why isn't it that I can't buy something for 10 cents, a song, with just one click of a button and it goes on my phone bill? Now my friend Jesus Banegas says, well, it's because the people at Santander don't want the people at Telefonica getting into the banking business. Now maybe that's true. And, you know, but we ought to figure this out, because somewhere between Telefonica and Santander, there is a pony there, as we say in the United States. One of the problems, though, is that we don't have a way to get down what is known as the long tail. Now, I don't know if you know what the long tail is, but this is an idea that was floated by the editor of Wired magazine 12 years ago, which was that in a world of internet connectivity, the hits were no longer important, that every little piece of niche content could find a market, and that the total number of all the little niches would be far greater than the worth of the hits. Well, it turns out this is not really true. And so this is a chart of the music business in 2011. So there were 8 million titles available for download. It turns out that 80% of the downloads were for 1% of the titles. That is, that the hits generated all the revenue. And as you can see, 6 million of the tunes sold less than 10 copies. Now, I assume if I'm a new band and I put out a tune, I can get my brother, my wife, my best friend, and I'll probably download one myself, and that means there are only 4 civilians that actually bought something. So that's a pretty sad situation. Now, why is this happening? Our belief is the reason this is happening is that Google, search engines, push popular stuff up the stack. And so the popular just keeps getting more and more popular, and there's no way for you to say, well, if I like that Muddy Waters tune, I might like this tune by Son House or something. There's no way to push you down the long tail in the existing tunes. So we believe that, and we're working with our friends at IBM, that some sort of cognitive computing ideas that really learn what you really like can help push you down the stack. Because, quite frankly, if this maintains truth, then there are 6 or 7 very, very large media companies, such as Viacom, Warner Brothers, and others, Disney, that are carrying film libraries, film and television libraries on their balance sheets in excess of $10 billion apiece. And if it's true that only the latest hit is something that people want to buy, then those film libraries are not worth $10 billion. They may be even not worth $10 million if this is true. So one has to hope that if you're going to exploit these huge libraries, you're going to have to figure out some way to get people to not do this and push them down the long tail. So, as I said, this should be the greatest time in the history of the media and entertainment business, but the problem is, for media and entertainment firms, revenues aren't growing 9x in 5 years. They're barely growing above the rate of inflation, about 4 to 5% if they're lucky, at the best firms. So, last spring, Steven Spielberg and George Lucas came out to USC and gave a consortium, and Spielberg gave this speech, and he said sometime in the next 3 years there's going to be an implosion where 3, 4, or maybe half a dozen mega budget movies are going to go crashing into the ground, and that's going to change the paradigm. Well, ironically, this started to happen about a week after he gave this speech. And by the end of the summer, 14 weeks later, 6 or 7 movies, each costing more than $100 million, had crashed into the ground. And as you can see from the chart from the Wall Street Journal, for the first time ever, the total budgets of those movies equaled the total take from the box office. Now, if you know something about the movie business, the film studios only get 50% of the box office take. So they were out all that money, plus they had to spend 30% more than the budget on marketing and entertainment. So our calculation is they probably lost somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 billion in 14 weeks. So the television business. So this is a chart of the broadcast TV ratings in the United States. They have fallen by 50% since 2002. So our research says that young people are no longer interested in getting cable and satellite, and what they really want is a big fat broadband pipe. And they go to college and they have 10 to 15, 20 megabits per second, and they get into the habit of consuming their media off of what is called in the States over-the-top platforms. That would be like Netflix, Hulu, illegal sites, pirate sites, all of that. But they're not really interested in having a big cable or a satellite dish on top of their roof. And in fact, Craig Moffat, who's been the biggest cheerleader for cable in the United States, admits that cord cutting, meaning I don't need cable or satellite, used to be an urban myth. It isn't anymore. So what's happening is, even though household formation in the States is coming back after the recession, the 29-year-old is moving out of mom's extra bedroom, getting their own house. They're not getting cable or satellite. And we can tell that this is a problem because we can see what the downstream bandwidth is taking up, all the bandwidth. Netflix, YouTube, BitTorrent. So more than 60% of the downstream bandwidth is taken up by video applications. So what does this mean? In the US and even here, you have what is called bundling, which means that you want a cable service, you have to take 100 channels, even though you may watch 5 channels. And so firms like ESPN, which is the largest sports provider, rely on these pass-throughs, that is the number of subscribers that take their service, plus advertising. So Barry Diller says, is it reasonable for 75 million people who don't want ESPN to pay for the 25 million who do? Well, that's a good question. But the question is, if the number of homes passed for ESPN fell from 100 million to 90 million, that would mean $50 million a month less for ESPN, which is owned by Disney. Our belief is they wouldn't just stand by and take $50 million less. They would offer an over-the-top ESPN service that you could get on any device, on your smartphone, on your iPad, anywhere you want, and you would pay 12 to 15 bucks for that. And if that happened, we believe the whole bundled universe would come undone, because HBO would follow right behind, and then all those channels, the French food cooking channel and the trout fishing channel and all these other useless channels would just disappear. And that would change the economics of television in a radical way. But what it really means is that the streaming paradigm of getting what you want, when you want it, on whatever device you want, would totally rule. And for telecoms and for content owners, we think that would be a good outcome. Now, this relates to the advertising business, because advertising is a very critical part of the media sector and obviously has financed much of television since the beginning of television. So as you well know, there's lots of merger activity going on in the advertising business. Publicis and Omnicom merged, and when they merged, they said the whole rationale behind the notion was big data. And we've heard this term, big data, today several times. And the notion about big data was that advertisers know a lot about you and then can direct advertising to you based on what your preferences are. And obviously, Google and Facebook have lots of big data. Publicis and Omnicom have no big data whatsoever. And so whether this is a smart, rational decision or not is something that's quite questionable. But the second more questionable part about it is the basic assumption on the part of most firms that young people, the people we teach, have no care for privacy, that they're willing to give up all their data to anybody with no return. And we don't think that's true. We think actually young people are very rational, and they will give up data in return for a better deal, but they won't give up data for free. And this little schematic, which is what's called real-time bidding, and some of you have probably experienced this. You went on a site to look for a vacation in Mexico, say, but you didn't do anything, you just looked at the site, but they dropped a cookie on your computer, and then you notice, God, everywhere I go, there's an ad for Mexican travel vacation, right? Well, what they've done is They're following you around, and these 4 firms are bidding for your attention in real time. And it happens in 30 microseconds, milliseconds. I mean, it's happened so fast that the real-time exchange says, oh, here's somebody who's about to open this ad, and they've got a cookie for Mexico. Who wants to get their attention for Mexico? And 4 or 5 firms bid on you. Well, that assumes that everybody's going to be happy to do that. We don't think that's true. And there are firms like Reputation.com that are already building systems to hold all your private data in a box and only bid it out if you have real ability to get some kind of discount. So the real problem with advertising is this. On the left is what happens in television. So in television, there is a limited number of ads in any given hour on any given channel. And so in general, supply always meets demand, everything sells, and prices, called CPMs, stay up. But on the web, there is an unlimited amount of ad inventory. There's always more supply than demand. And so CPMs are always forced lower. And if you looked at the statistics from Yahoo or Google in the last 2 weeks when they announced their earnings, CPMs were down almost 7% quarter over quarter. That is not a sustainable business model. Now, they may be selling more ads because of mobile, but their price they're getting per unit of inventory is falling dramatically, and that will not sustain. The third problem is the problem of social media. You will have noticed that many firms want to advertise how many followers they have on Twitter or Facebook. The problem with this is that most of these followers are fake. So here's Whole Foods. Whole Foods, almost 50% of the people who follow Whole Foods on Twitter are bots. They're not real people. Those bots are not buying any food, I promise you. And why is this happening? Well, there are firms that do nothing but sell you followers. Just Google buy Twitter followers, and you can buy for a fairly cheap price lots of followers. So when we were doing the social analytic work on the presidential race, we noticed that Mitt Romney was gaining about 2,000 Twitter followers a day, and 3 days before the Republican convention, in one day he got 198,000 followers. Well, guess what? 92% of them were bots. He just bought followers. Now, you would think, well, that's just kind of stupid, and who would want to care about that? Well, the problem is that Twitter has now made a deal with Nielsen, the rating service, so that the follower count of a TV show is also going to count into the advertising ratings. So if I can just game the system, and I have a new TV show, and I buy 1 million followers, what point does that have? And what does that mean in terms of social engagement? So this is problematic. So home entertainment. The biggest problem that's happening, and the reason the firms that we work with in the media space are having so much heartburn, is this slide. So the home entertainment business is making a transition from the DVD in black to streaming in red. And it's happening much faster than any of them ever wanted. Because what they're doing is trading analog dollars for digital dimes. And the problem is that the bottom line for them is really getting eroded. It used to be that you could count on selling 3 million DVDs for any given movie. That business is over. Blockbuster just finally surrendered 2 weeks ago and just gave up the ghost completely. Nobody wants DVDs anymore. Video games. A lot of people think that the video game business is immune to creative destruction, but it's not true. This is a chart of every single console platform, and as you can see, 2008 was the high point, and it's been straight downhill ever since then. Now, there's a new generation of consoles coming on the market, but they will not take it back to the 2008 level. And if you say to me, well, people have moved to mobile games, I just ask you to look at the financial results of a company called Zynga, and you'll see that is not a good business. It's a terrible business, and it's a business totally dependent on Facebook. So this is not any place to hide if you're a media investor. Now, this is the one positive sign in the business, and it's why I believe the mobile platform and Telefónica's business is going to be so important. This is the music business. Now, this is a global chart, but if I had shown you a chart for just the United States, the digital is more than 50% of revenue today. In other words, the physical has gone away, and the physical represents about 40%, and the digital represents about 60%. And the reason that is because there's so many streaming platforms, whether it's Deezer or Spotify or any one of these platforms, and these are persistent, and they keep paying revenue every day. This is probably the saddest slide of all. Basically, if you think 50 years of gains in newspaper advertising revenue wiped out in 5 years. So for me, some of these are what game theorists would call collective action problems. I tell my students, I explain what I mean by the prisoner's dilemma, which is one of the classic game theory ideas, is that India and Pakistan both spend billions of dollars a year on missiles aimed at each other, and they're no more secure than if they had spent no money on missiles and spent all that money educating their young people. That is essentially what happened in the movie business last summer. Every studio rolled out their big guns every weekend. They dumped 7 movies into the marketplace every week, each of them costing $100 million a piece, and they basically canceled each other out, and everybody lost. All of this is in pursuit of something called market share. Now, market share may make sense in Coke versus Pepsi. It makes no sense in the movie business or any other media business, because basically all it's measuring is gross revenues. It tells you nothing about return on investment or how much it costs to get that money. If you spent $300 million to make a movie and it made $400 million, it's a terrible thing. It may mean a lot in your market share account, but it means nothing on your bottom line. And then, of course, the other game theory problem is free riding. This is the biggest problem, obviously. The more people want stuff for free and they steal it, the more people who are actually having to pay for it are going to have to pay. So in the ideal world that I described at the beginning of 5 billion smartphones, you ought to be able to sell a tune for 10 cents, right? Because if everybody was paying and you got 10% market share for 10 cents, you know, some gigantic amount of money. But now on iTunes you have to buy it for $1.29. That's because most people are trying to steal it and only a few people are actually paying for it. So what is the result of all this? Well, the first thing is that for media and entertainment firms, return on assets are falling significantly below the rest of the economy. And more importantly, labor productivity for media and entertainment firms are really below the rest of the economy. Now, the reason for this is twofold. One, it's very hard to automate the work of the guy who's doing the props on Mad Men. You know, he's got to be paid. You can't turn him into a robot. The cameraman has to be paid. And the second thing, of course, is that the fact that Disney is willing to pay Johnny Depp $20 million to be in the Lone Ranger that tanks distorts the productivity levels. And by the way, as someone mentioned to me, Universal Music, owned by Vivendi, has 12 executives making more than $1 million a year. Mercedes-Benz does not have 12 executives making more than $1 million a year in salary. So that may be one of the other problems. So these signposts of disruption, we think, are actually signposts of opportunity, and here's why. We think that what's happening, and this is in the United States, but I think it'll happen here just as much, is there's a whole new set of platforms of companies using cheap internet distribution, that is IP distribution, to get content to you over a variety of platforms that will arrive on any device you want at any time you want on demand. And these platforms are creating all sorts of new sources of crowdfunding and all sorts of other ways for people to get money for content. And these platforms are proliferating. Here's 12 of them, but there's 5 or 6 more in the United States. Now, whether the market can sustain 18 or 20 of them, I don't know. But the point is that ultimately, 1 or 2 of them will develop that perfect algorithm that delivers to you exactly the content you want at the exact moment you want, because they really learn your taste in the way that, quite frankly, Amazon has been able to do in the book business. It hasn't really done it in the video business yet because it hasn't gotten to scale. But I'm sure there's a lot of people thinking about the algorithms to make that work. These platforms are also creating all sorts of new kinds of content that are not bounded by the traditional advertising-driven lowest common denominator taste level, but are more bounded by the notions that because Netflix knew that a huge number of their subscribers liked Kevin Spacey, liked David Fincher, liked the English version of House of Cards, they could take a big gamble and spend a lot of money on making a House of Cards. But on the other side of the picture, this little series for Hulu called East Los High was made for $120,000 an episode. Now, they can't even turn on a camera on a TV series for $120,000 for one day. And this was a series aimed strictly at the Hispanic market in the United States, and it worked. It worked phenomenally well. So what's happening? Well, the thing that's really happening is what we call media crossover. That is the time spent on digital platforms, whether it's a PC, a tablet, or a mobile phone, is eclipsing the time spent on TV. And that's pretty phenomenal, given, quite frankly, that I think that the Nielsen measure of the time spent on TV is totally nonsense. I think what happens I don't know if you know about the Nielsen ratings, but that basically they have these set-top boxes in 2,400 homes in the United States, and they measure every 15 minutes what channel the TV is on. My theory is that people who have a Nielsen box in their home just leave the TV on all the time, whether they're watching it or not, because they feel some obligation to be TV watchers. So the notion that the average household watches 8 hours of TV a day seems to me totally bizarre. But anyway, even with all that, the total time spent on digital devices is more than that. So what else is happening? Well, one of the most fascinating things that's happening is the era of high band. And by the way, we're working with 2 firms, Google and a firm called EPB, both of whom have put fiber optic into the house at 1 gigabit per second symmetrical. 1 gigabit both ways. So what is that going to do? Well, it's going to create all sorts of new applications. On the right is something called Oculus Rift. It's a $120 virtual reality helmet. You put it on, and I put it on in a test a couple of weeks ago, and the kid who was running it said, "Okay, hold on," and I'm in a room, And the next thing I know, the floor has dropped away 2,000 feet, and I'm standing on a rail, and there's a patch of grass on the other side, and if I could walk, if my heart would stop beating so fast, I could actually walk over to this patch of grass. Now, I know the floor hasn't dropped away, but I swear to God, in every way possible, the floor had dropped away. Now, if you think about that helmet in 4K, the highest level of HD video, symmetrical, so I'm playing a game with Gonzalo when we're in different locations, I would need about 600 megabits per second to do that. So what we think is going to happen is all sorts of new ways of storytelling will come out from these platforms. One of my students is designing a translation application for Google Glass. So I could go into a movie theater in Madrid and have subtitles in English for that movie, you know, using a kind of Shazam-like technology. 3D printing. Why isn't that part of the media and entertainment business? So when Warner Brothers releases Batman versus Superman on home download, digital download in a year and a half, part of the download ought to be a download to a 3D printer, and your son could make a Batman toy and pose him exactly the way he wants, manufacture him, paint him, hold him up in front of the Xbox Connect or one of the 3D applications you got, and maybe it unlocks some secret content for him and his friends. You know, I mean, so this is, again, think about the possibilities in this new world. So the question we want to pose is, could the current production distribution system simply not be capturing the possibilities of this new wired world of 5 billion consumers? Really, it's a research and executive education project, because part of the problem is that there's a lot of executives in big media firms who've grown up in a world where the DVD business was great, and they assumed they were in the home video business, and their whole job was to take a trip to Bentonville, Arkansas, where Walmart's headquarters were, once a quarter and sell them 20 million DVDs. That business is gone. So we want to build it around 4 pillars. The new creators and makers. And this is something that I think is going to happen in this culture, because you think about a culture in terms of 400 million people speaking Spanish, ability of wanting content not with subtitles but just real content that's on these devices, and there are going to be new kinds of forms of content, 3-minute stories, 4-minute stories, new metrics and measurements. Part of the problem is it's very hard to tell the difference between a passive viewer and a very engaged fan. And we think that that's really important, because we think that the engaged viewer is probably watching more commercials, watching more stuff, and stays in the seat, you know. New business models, obviously new ways of funding content, and new screens, because as I said, with things like Oculus Rift, there'll be all sorts of web. So that's basically what we're trying to do. I'm totally open to questions if anybody wants to ask one, and otherwise we'll take it from there.
Thank you very much for your bright presentation on these schemes, but I didn't hear anything about second screen. That is this new way of watching media, and in the 2 ways. Let me say, the second screen that is created in a self-organized way between friends, or the second screen that is supported by content producers to create that society helping that and including watermarks and any other thing, but I think it will add some part of your presentation.
We've done quite a bit of work on second screen, and quite frankly, we're a little disappointed in it. In other words, we don't think that people are really contributing a lot of content while they're watching a TV program. In other words, the whole idea of the second screen was, I'm watching this program, but I'm also commenting with my friends on my iPad and creating new content that supports the thing. We don't think that's what's really happening, at least in the States. A lot of money has been spent on second screen applications, and not a lot of results have shown up for us that it's really happening. Quite frankly, if people are really enjoying the show, they're not spending a lot of time typing on their iPads with their friends about it. And so the best second screen applications have been the sports leagues. The NFL has a brilliant mobile app that just gives you statistics all the time, and it's very useful. But other than that, we don't think narrative content is utilizing second screen quite yet.
There are a lot of people thinking that second screen is the future to evade the problems of the present.
I think they are, and I think they're making a mistake. I think they're going to spend a lot of money, and probably a lot of venture capital will go into it, and it's the dogs aren't eating the dog food.
Yes, hello. Thank you for the presentation. Very, very interesting. On the one side, you show us that the advertising revenue is dropping, but at the same time, all these new models will have to be funded somehow. So what's your view on the new business models that you have here?
Well, I mean, there's two questions. One of which is that I do think there has to be some kind of advertising subsidized model on the mobile platform. Because even though the kid in Africa can buy a mobile phone for $25, he's not going to have a $50 data plan. I mean, that can't be supported. So the question is, how is he going to get content unless it's somehow advertised or supported? You know, there's lots of pretty interesting, what we call click-through advertising ads. So you have a little 15-second ad, and then you click it, and you can link through to an e-commerce opportunity or to a website or something. So we think that the technology is all there to support that. And actually, if you look at Facebook's data, a huge amount of content is being created, consumed on this screen as opposed to the PC. And Facebook has managed to migrate their advertising platform into this mobile platform. So I think it can be done. So that's the first thing. The second thing is this idea of micropayments. And I was kidding our friend from Santander, but I do think that there needs to be some interesting way of doing micropayments, because obviously you can't use a credit card for a 20-cent purchase. The credit card takes up more than 20 cents for the transaction. So somehow, obviously, telephone companies have been billing very small transactions, a 10-cent phone call for years. So why can't they get into this microtransaction business to buy a song for 20 cents? And so that's one thing. I mean, clearly, if you look at the Spotify model in the music business, a kind of semi-ad supported, moving people up to premium if they get to really love it, seems to be working. So whether that can transfer into the video business, we'll see.
Let me just simply just for one second here. the whole market associated with media and entertainment is changing dramatically in a very few years. And there are here at least 3 types of drivers for that. One is technology innovation, and that appears in new things. On the other hand, another important driver, the change of customer needs or user needs. That's also important. But it's also something that I couldn't see very much here, and for me it's also important, is to have new type of contents that could be really needed for this kind of new things. Because at the end, you could have a push effort on the 3D TV or something like that. At the end, you haven't. And the type of content that's worth the value for that, you know. Do you think that it's also a crisis of content?
Well, I mean, to me, what's so fascinating is if the majority of people are connecting to the internet through this device, then we're going to have new kinds of stories, because quite frankly, I don't know if I want to watch a 2-hour movie on this device, but I do, as someone pointed out, maybe want to watch a series of 3-minute stories that slowly build, like Charles Dickens, into a serial that maybe I can put them all together and they'd be one story, but they keep me tuning in again and again and again. And exactly what that kind of storytelling is, I'm not positive. And I think, you know, social networks have a part of that. You know, how does the feedback come after the first episode that the fans, you know, I mean, Henry Jenkins, who's a pretty important guy in my lab, you know, has this notion of spreadable media, and he calls it participatory culture. So how does the fan engage with the story and help craft next week's episode and stuff like that? So yeah, I think there's going to be lots of new ways, and that's why, from my point of view, when businesses are in chaos, that's why possibilities of new entrants coming into the platform seem so interesting. If you think about 5 billion streaming devices and a huge percent of that population is Spanish speaking, then why isn't, you know, this media content world, culture, taking more leadership in that? And that to me is the real challenge. You know, I mean, one of the things that's fascinating about this in terms of our discussion earlier today is many of the applications that are built for this kind of new world of content are not patentable. I mean, you think about Facebook, there's no patents on Facebook, there's no patents on Instagram, there's no patents in almost any of these new huge places. But they are incredibly cool applications that are built and lead into spin-outs, and as you pointed out, the cost of getting those things up and running are incredibly nothing. I mean, Instagram, which sold for $1 billion, had 10 employees and was using Amazon Web Services for its whole platform. It had almost no capital investment whatsoever.